Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the HOA that declared my land to be shared property. In fact, I had always counted myself lucky to have inherited a large stretch of farmland from my grandfather. It's not just some random patch of grass and a few bushes. I'm talking acres upon acres of gorgeous soil and a sprawling orchard full of apple trees. My grandfather taught me all about caring for the land, preserving the orchard, and living off the bounty it provided. But never in my wildest dreams did I expect that same land to become the battleground for a dispute involving people who believed they had some right to my property because they lived nearby. I discovered the problem one brisk autumn morning. I had been planning to get up early to harvest apples. The early morning sun illuminated the dew on the grass, and the entire orchard looked like it was glimmering. I remember breathing in, amazed at how clean the air felt in those precious minutes. My dog, Coco, a sweet Labrador mix, was as excited as ever, bounding ahead of me and chasing stray leaves. Nothing indicated that this day would go any differently from my regular routine of orchard checks and general farm maintenance. But as I made my way down the gravel path, I saw something odd posted near the entrance. There, almost comically large, was a brand new sign. It featured a bold, eye-catching statement in huge letters: "Shared property. Open to HOA residents." I immediately did a double take, blinked a few times, and glanced around, wondering if I'd stumbled onto a candid prank. It made no sense. My property wasn't, and had never been, part of any HOA. My grandfather purchased this land decades ago with the clear intention that it would remain private, family-owned farmland. We had no legal ties to the adjoining subdivision. If there was a homeowners association in the neighborhood across the street, it certainly had nothing to do with us. This sign had to be some bizarre mistake, but when I got closer, I saw there wasn't just one sign. There were at least 3 of them placed at various points along the property's perimeter. All were equally bizarre. Some declared HOA community use area, while others stated private property for HOA members. To my disbelief, someone was brazen enough to even hammer one sign into the dirt path that led from my driveway to the orchard. That sign read, "Every neighbor deserves access to nature, and you have so much of it." It was so ridiculous it took me a moment to process. I wasted no time ripping one of those signs out of the ground and carrying it straight to my workshop. I needed a moment to think, and maybe text a couple of friends to see if this was some brand of local humor I wasn't aware of. My longtime friend Jonah was the first person I reached out to. He and I had grown up together, and he'd often come out to the farm to help me with orchard tasks. He had also dealt with some strange property boundary issues in his life, though nothing quite like what I was seeing here. I sent him a photo of the sign, half expecting him to burst out laughing or assure me it was a silly prank. But Jonah took it seriously. He wrote back, "Man, that's no joke. That symbol at the bottom of the sign is actually the mark of that big HOA near your property boundary. The one that's always complaining about something or another. I've heard rumors about them." My mind started to spin with questions. Was it possible they believed they could just annex farmland because it was adjacent to their neat rows of suburban houses? Who gave them the right to step onto my property, plant a sign, and declare it as if it were communal land? This wasn't the first time I'd heard unusual tales about that HOA. A friend of a friend had once told me about how they sent out mandatory lawn mowing reminders even to people who weren't members, but I never expected them to target my orchard. I hopped on my ATV and drove the length of the property to see if there were more signs. Sure enough, I found a cluster of them near the back fence line. They read, "Every neighbor should have their own apple tree, and you have thousands of them. Sharing is caring." That made my blood boil a little. It wasn't just that they were labeling my orchard as shared property, but they were also effectively telling me that because I had thousands of apple trees, they could help themselves to them. It was so outrageous I couldn't decide whether to laugh or call the authorities right away. I started collecting the signs, methodically pulling them out of the ground, stuffing them into the back of my truck. I was planning on going straight to the local police station to file a complaint. But before I did, I wanted to call my neighbor Adam, who lived on a separate piece of land on the other side of my property. He was usually in the know about local matters. When he answered, he confirmed that he'd heard whisperings from the HOA about trying to expand community resources by encouraging local landowners to open up their acreage. Adam told me, "I just never thought they'd go so far as to actually claim your land. That's madness." It sure felt like madness. I thought maybe I should give the HOA a chance to explain themselves before jumping straight into legal action. The next day, I hopped into my truck and drove over to that shiny little HOA office building I'd seen at the edge of their neighborhood. It was one of those modern glass front buildings with a bright reception area and potted plants in the foyer. I walked in holding one of their stolen signs, a polite but firm expression on my face. The receptionist, a young woman, gave me a startled look as I approached. I calmly asked to speak with whoever was in charge. She asked if I had an appointment. I answered no, but added that it was urgent. A few minutes later, I was escorted into a conference room. There, I was met by a man who introduced himself as Rex, which I suspected might not have been his real name. He was tall, with a crisp polo shirt bearing the HOA's insignia, and an air of someone who was used to getting his way. I placed the sign on the conference table between us and asked him, very politely, why it was on my land. He looked at the sign, then at me, and then explained in a tone that was borderline condescending that the Homeowners Association had collectively decided it was unfair that I possessed so many acres while they had so little community green space. It was just a matter of equality, he said. He claimed I had thousands of apple trees and that every homeowner in the area ought to have one. He asserted that my orchard was a wasted resource if only one person was going to reap the benefits. I couldn't believe his gall. Trying to keep my composure, I asked Rex on what legal basis he thought they could step onto my property, plant signs, and treat it as if it belonged to them. He smiled in that condescending way and said, "We're exploring options. Legally, we have a lot of say in how community resources are allocated." He talked about wanting to be friendly and neighborly, but kept using phrases like fair share and communal property. I realized this was going nowhere. I told him plainly that I would remove any signs on my land, and that if they continued to trespass, I wouldn't hesitate to contact the authorities. Rex's facade of politeness slipped. He insisted that I was needlessly hoarding land, and he offered to work out an arrangement where I'd allow them to carve out a large chunk of my property for community use. I refused, reminding him again that I was not part of any HOA and that my orchard was protected by private property rights. He smirked and said, "We'll see about that." That's when I decided there was nothing more to discuss. I grabbed the sign and headed out, ignoring his attempts to hurl a few more passive-aggressive comments. When I got home, I was upset, but I tried to calm down. I reminded myself that even though the HOA was powerful in their own little domain, they had zero legal ownership over my orchard. People trespass from time to time, but usually they're just curious hikers or local kids who want to see my orchard. But I never expected a structured HOA to so blatantly infringe on my rights. I resolved to keep an eye out, expecting the trouble to escalate. And escalate it did. Over the next week, I started noticing more and more footprints and signs of activity near the edges of my property. I also found random people strolling deep into my orchard, acting as if it were a public park. I once approached a family picking apples off my trees. They were loading them into canvas bags. When I politely confronted them, the father said, "The HOA told us these apple trees are part of our community orchard now. They said the landowner gave his permission. Are you not the caretaker?" I assured him calmly that I was the owner, and that I certainly hadn't given anyone permission. He looked mortified and apologized profusely, promising to return the apples. But the kids were already excited, and I told them to keep what they'd picked. The family hurried away, embarrassed, as though they'd been lied to by someone in a position of authority. That got me thinking. The HOA was actively spreading misinformation. They must have distributed some kind of newsletter or announcement, encouraging residents to treat my orchard as though it were their own. I hopped online to check if they posted something on their community site. Sure enough, in a public notice board, they'd typed up a short blurb about expanded HOA privileges, referencing an arrangement made with the orchard's owner. It was all a blatant lie. I took screenshots of everything, printing them out to add to my growing stack of evidence. Word started spreading around town. People who knew me kept calling, sharing rumors about the HOA's claims. One rumor was that the HOA was planning to build a fence across my land, dividing it into small garden plots for residents. Another rumor was that they were going to pave a path for morning joggers. The craziest rumor was that they were going to petition the city council to seize my orchard for a public park. I had no idea how true any of that was, but it all sounded outlandish enough for me not to dismiss it entirely, especially given the signs I'd seen. Around this time, a close friend, Linda, visited me. She's an attorney, although her specialty is more about estate planning than property disputes. Still, she's knowledgeable about the law and quickly became alarmed at the situation. She advised me to be proactive, maybe to send a cease and desist letter to the HOA. She helped me draft one, explaining in legal terms that my land was private and that any future trespassing or attempts to claim it as community property would result in immediate legal action. I mailed it to their official address, emailed it to Rex, and even posted a copy on the boundary of my land next to the orchard, just in case there was any confusion from passers-by. I hoped that would be enough to put an end to this nonsense. But the next twist in this bizarre saga came one crisp morning when I heard the roar of machinery from the direction of my driveway. Racing outside, I saw a group of workers in orange vests setting up equipment at the far edge of my orchard. They had cones and were unloading what looked like metal poles and fencing materials. Without hesitation, I marched over to them, demanding to know who they were and why they were on my property. One older worker looked baffled, saying they'd been hired by the HOA to install community resource fences. I told them they had absolutely no right to do so and that they were trespassing. They seemed genuinely confused. I couldn't blame them. They were just hired contractors. But this was definitely a turning point. The HOA was actively paying people to transform my orchard into something for their own use. Furious, I whipped out my phone and called the local police station right then and there. An officer named Carla arrived about 30 minutes later. She was cordial but firm, wanting to understand the situation. I showed her the boundary lines on an old survey map, proving that the orchard was within my property. The contractors, seeing the police, decided to pack up immediately, clearly not wanting to be in the middle of a property dispute. Officer Carla took down all the details. She expressed disbelief that an HOA would act so brazenly, but said she would make a report, which I could use if I needed to escalate matters. I figured that might finally teach the HOA to back off. However, the final straw came a few days after that. The orchard had become an unsettling hotspot for random visitors at all hours, some claiming they had the right to be there because their HOA said so. Others were clueless tourists who thought they'd stumbled upon a free orchard experience. It became exhausting. I tried to be patient and kind, but it was draining and inherently wrong that I had to patrol my own property like a security guard. On one particular afternoon, I spotted a large group of folks near the orchard's northern boundary. They had set up folding chairs and even a little grill, as though they were enjoying a weekend picnic. I marched over to them, politely explaining they were on private property. A few were apologetic, but a couple of them scoffed, pointing to those ridiculous signs and claiming it was shared property. They refused to leave until I threatened to call the police. The following day, I saw the ultimate act of gall from the HOA itself. Rex, the very same man who had smiled at me so smugly in that conference room, was on my property, leading a tour of sorts. He had a clipboard and was walking around with several HOA board members, talking about how they might divide the orchard into sections for maximum community benefit. I watched from a distance, dumbfounded. These people had clearly lost any sense of boundary or decency, so I decided enough was enough. I marched right up to Rex's little group, confronted them in the calmest voice I could manage, though inside I was seething, and told them they were trespassing. Rex tried to talk over me, saying that my orchard was practically in the HOA's domain, and that he had every right to figure out how to allocate resources. That's when I told him, in no uncertain terms, that I was calling the police, and I did so right in front of him. He rolled his eyes as if I were being irrational, but the rest of his committee members started looking worried. Officer Carla arrived, accompanied by another officer. This time, I showed them the repeated evidence, photos, the official letter I sent, the local property records, and the fact that I'd already had to call about trespassers. Rex was surprisingly bold, claiming that I was withholding resources and that the HOA was entitled to utilize farmland for community betterment. He insisted that the orchard was essential to the well-being of the neighborhood. Officer Carla, clearly fed up, asked Rex if he had any legal documentation to back up these claims. Of course he didn't. She then asked him to leave the property. His refusal set off a chain reaction. One of the officers told Rex that if he didn't comply, they'd have no choice but to arrest him for trespassing. He tried to argue, but in the end, I guess he realized they weren't bluffing. He turned to leave, throwing me a glare that could scorch the entire orchard. Some of the board members scattered like roaches, muttering about contacting their lawyers. But for Rex, It didn't end there. As it turned out, Rex made one critical mistake. He laid a hand on the officer's arm as he was trying to walk away, in an apparent attempt to argue or push past. It wasn't a violent gesture, but it was enough to cross the line. The officer sternly told him that he was obstructing them. The next thing I knew, Rex was being handcuffed on my very own gravel driveway. It felt surreal to see the entire fiasco unfold. For a moment, I was almost speechless. Part of me was shocked it had escalated to this level, and another part of me was frankly relieved that his arrogance had finally caught up with him. I later learned from a neighbor who had connections in local government that Rex ended up spending a night in custody and had to appear before a judge. The judge apparently was not impressed with Rex's attempts to paint me as some villain hoarding farmland. In fact, from what I heard, the judge gave him an earful about respecting private property laws. The HOA's attorney was present, and they tried to mitigate the damage by claiming everything was just a misunderstanding. But by that time, it was too late. Rex had crossed a line not only by trespassing, but also by defying a direct police warning. After that incident, everything changed. The signs disappeared overnight, like magic. It was as if the HOA realized the entire stunt wasn't worth the potential legal trouble. I also heard that the board replaced Rex as their figurehead, or at least suspended him while they figured out their internal politics. Meanwhile, word had spread around the neighborhood that the orchard was off limits. Most people stayed away, probably not wanting a run-in with the law. I no longer encountered families picking apples or setting up picnics without permission. Every once in a while, I'd see a curious jogger, but a polite sign on the fence was enough to send them back to the sidewalk. The orchard felt peaceful again, exactly as it should be. You might think the story ended there, but there were still a few aftershocks. For one, I discovered that the HOA had been collecting contributions from some residents to fund the orchard project. That meant people had actually been paying additional dues to turn my private property into a shared resource. I felt sorry for them. They'd wasted their money based on Rex's fantasy that the orchard could be forcibly shared. Some of those neighbors actually reached out to me, apologizing and saying they'd been misled. I told them it was water under the bridge. They'd been duped as much as I had been harassed. On the advice of Linda and a couple of other attorney acquaintances, I also filed a formal civil complaint against the HOA, purely to protect myself from any future nonsense. We ended up settling out of court, with the HOA formally agreeing that they had no claim to my orchard and that they would never set foot on my land again without explicit permission. They also covered some of my legal fees. I was satisfied to have everything in writing, so there couldn't be a repeat of this fiasco. I know lawsuits can be a hassle, but this one felt necessary just to maintain my peace of mind. In the wake of all this, I decided to make some minor changes around my property. I installed a few security cameras to cover the driveway and orchard entrance. I posted well-marked signs stating, "Private property, no trespassing." I also improved the fencing in certain areas to make the boundary crystal clear. It wasn't something I wanted to do. My grandfather had always maintained a friendly, open environment for locals who wanted to stop by with permission. But given the HOA fiasco, I needed to be extra cautious. I still occasionally allow close friends and trusted members of the community to pick apples or walk through the orchard. I'm not against sharing, I just think it needs to be done lawfully and respectfully, not by hostile takeover. That's not the end of the personal ramifications, though. My orchard had long been the place where I found comfort and joy. After dealing with so much hostility and blatant trespassing, I went through a period of feeling anxious every time I heard a car approach my driveway. I worried it was another group from the HOA or more signage attempts. For a while, I'd get that uneasy knot in my stomach just seeing a new car pass by. But over time, that tension subsided. I slowly got back into my normal rhythm, feeding the chickens, watering the orchard, harvesting apples, and managing my small vegetable patch. Coco, my dog, also sensed my stress during that period, and after everything settled, she returned to her usual playful self, bounding around the orchard without a care. I won't lie, the entire ordeal changed me. It made me more protective of my property, but it also reinforced my belief in standing up for my rights, no matter how big or intimidating the opposing side might seem. The HOA tried to paint me as greedy simply because I owned a large piece of land, but having more doesn't mean you owe it to everyone else, especially not if they're going to trespass, lie, and try to steal it out from under you. If they had approached me in a civil manner from the start, like normal neighbors might, I might have considered some form of cooperative arrangement. Perhaps a day where local kids could come pick apples for free, or a small community gathering in one of the outer fields. But any possibility of that died the moment they planted those outrageous signs and tried to bulldoze my rights. Speaking of bulldozing, there was a tangential story that ran parallel to this entire fiasco. Around the time the HOA began invading my orchard, an old friend of mine named Sasha was going through her own property dispute in a completely different context. She lived about 20 miles away, near a suburban development that was being expanded by a real estate company. The developers kept moving boundary markers on her land to make it seem like their new road needed more space. She too had to stand her ground, eventually filing a complaint with the county to force them to respect her official survey lines. Though her ordeal was separate from mine, our experiences bonded us more deeply. We frequently exchanged updates, supported each other, and even shared legal tips. Sasha's success in stopping the developers from encroaching on her land was a personal victory I celebrated with her. In turn, she cheered me on each time I made progress with my HOA standoff. Knowing someone else who was going through a similar but different property dispute gave me perspective and kept me from feeling completely isolated. Another side note, my orchard was once the site of an annual harvest festival. We hadn't held one in a few years because of logistical issues, but the fiasco with the HOA made me nostalgic for the sense of community it used to bring. Back in the day, we'd have hay rides, caramel apple stands, and local vendors selling homemade jams. It was always a blast. After the dust settled with the HOA, I started considering reviving that tradition, inviting genuinely appreciative folks who have respect for other people's property. I believe that bridging the gap with genuinely polite neighbors might repair the relationships that the HOA tried so hard to sabotage. If I bring it back, I'd do so under a clear understanding that it's a private event, by invitation, not some free-for-all. That way, the orchard could bring joy to others, while still retaining the boundaries that keep me safe from opportunists like Rex. Of course, the entire fiasco wasn't just limited to orchard politics. The drama extended into the local coffee shop scene. Since it's a small town, gossip spreads quickly. For weeks, the central topic of conversation was how the HOA tried to claim farmland. I remember going into a coffee shop one Saturday morning and seeing people do a double take when they recognized me. At one table, I overheard two patrons discussing the orchard fiasco. They described the story with an almost mythical flair, like it was some tall tale. I smiled to myself, sipping my latte, feeling strangely amused that I'd become a local legend of sorts. That small-town rumor mill also gave me an unexpected ally in the form of the local city council member, who called me personally to ask if everything was all right and if the city could assist in some way. I told him I had it handled, but I appreciated his concern. He confided that the city had received multiple complaints about the HOA overstepping boundaries in other ways, such as demanding compliance from non-HOA members and issuing unsolicited fines. It seemed the orchard fiasco was just a public example of a broader pattern of overreach. This council member assured me that if the HOA attempted any official maneuver, like trying to incorporate my land into a zoning change, he would let me know. That gave me some peace of mind. A related plot line unfolded with another neighbor named Quinn, whose property was near the HOA's boundary. Quinn had a few goats and a small alpaca enclosure, which had apparently annoyed some of the HOA members who disliked hearing animals so close to their pristine neighborhoods. They had once tried to pressure Quinn into rehoming those animals, claiming it diminished property values. Quinn had refused, pointing out that his land was zoned for agricultural use. Though the goats occasionally made noise, that was part of country life. In solidarity, Quinn reached out to me after hearing about my orchard, telling me to stay strong. He told me that some HOA folks had gone as far as to photograph his goats and distribute those photos in an HOA meeting, claiming they needed to put a stop to rural intrusion. If that doesn't encapsulate the bizarre, controlling nature of certain individuals, I don't know what does. As for Rex, I never saw him again personally after he was taken away in handcuffs. I did hear rumors that he left town, possibly to move to a different state where he wouldn't be the talk of the community. One rumor even claimed he tried to start his own consulting business, ironically focusing on property management. I have no idea if that's true, but the thought of him giving expert advice on property rights is a bit laughable after what he tried to pull. Sometimes I wonder if he ever reflects on the fiasco and regrets his brazen approach. Then again, maybe he believes he was in the right all along. Some people never learn. The day the police officially warned the HOA that they could no longer enter my property without written permission felt like a defining moment in this whole experience. Standing in my orchard, with the smell of fresh apples in the air, I exhaled a long-held breath of relief. I realized how precious it is to have a place you can call your own, where your peace and sense of safety isn't threatened by the whims of others. My orchard, passed down by my grandfather, represented not just land, but also my family's legacy, our values, and the fruits of our labor, literally and figuratively. I wasn't about to let some overzealous board members trample on that. And in the end, justice sided with me. After everything settled, I had a barbecue at my orchard for close friends and supportive neighbors who had stood by me. We grilled hamburgers, hot dogs, and yes, even some apple-themed desserts. Jonah, Adam, Linda, and Quinn all came, along with their families. We laughed about how surreal the last few months had been. Jonah joked that I should hang one of the confiscated HOA signs in my workshop as a trophy of victory. I might just do that. Place it right next to a framed copy of my cease and desist letter, as a reminder that we overcame an absurd situation by standing our ground. I've also decided to set aside a small portion of the orchard to be a designated Community Day zone, where once a year I'll invite families from the area, those who actually ask politely, to pick apples and learn about farming. It feels like a balanced way to share what I have without compromising my boundaries. That's the difference. I'm choosing to share, rather than having it stolen from me. Voluntary generosity is something I respect. Forced sharing dictated by an HOA that has no legal right to my land? Absolutely not. Even though the drama has ended and most folks have moved on, I still get the occasional question from strangers who've heard about the orchard fiasco. Some want the full story. Others just want a quick summary, and a small handful express shock that something so brazen could happen at all. I always emphasize that property rights are taken seriously where I live, and that ignoring them can lead to real consequences, like an HOA boss getting arrested in broad daylight. Friends, thank you. See you soon.